morning. It's the complexity.
Go down
forward
to the lower
there.
left with the mouse.
Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah, we need to make sure we share the screen.
Any event, it's wonderful to have the opportunity to meet with Howard Weiner and Barbara last night. And you know, a couple months ago, I was talking to Melissa Lopresti and I said, who should we consider for Van Wagenen? And she said, Howard. He is not only incredibly talented, but one of the nicest human beings she's ever met. And so it was
Keyboard doesn't work. Oh, yeah, you're back in business.
back into it. So any event, it was a great pleasure to meet Howard last night and to have him here as the 29th Van Wagenen lecturer. And obviously, a couple of things before we say something about Kat. But tonight, Adriana just asked me to announce that, remember, you're not parking at Dr. Mattingly's house. There's alternate parking right down the street in the shuttle. So just, remember that. And I think everybody has the correct address. But Kat is chief resident. We're going to celebrate her tonight. Howard Silverstein is going to roast her tonight. Has done a fantastic job. She's going to toast her, right? And Kat, really wonderful to have you here for these 7 years. And we're very proud of everything you've accomplished. I look forward to hearing what you're doing in the future. And of course, to have your large contributions to the Resident Education Endowment Fund 10 years from now. We're going to be looking for those. We're trying to build that fund. So this is our itinerary today. I'm going to talk for just a few minutes. Dr. Weiner is going to speak at 8 o'clock. Sort of the fireside chat, lessons learned in leadership. At 9 o'clock, he's going to give a Van Wagenen lecture. Evolution of pediatric epilepsy surgery over 25 years, tuberous sclerosis as a paradigm. Then we have case presentations. We'll be in here for those. I think the resident's photograph is in break from 11 to 11:30. Then we have lunch in the Van Wagenen room, and Howard's going to discuss his epilepsy surgery missions in Panama. Which he's been doing for a number of years, and I know Melissa participated in at least one of those. Then tonight, of course, we're at Dr. Mattingly's house. So this lectureship is in honor of many things, but Dr. Van Wagenen was the stimulus for it. He was born just outside of Rochester in a country town, Nunday. Grew up in another country town, Worcester, where he graduated from high school with 14 students. He had a full scholarship to Cornell, and then another full scholarship to Harvard Medical School. And following an internship at Memorial Hospital, he studied with Harvey Cushing. Became devoted to Dr. Cushing, and Dr. Cushing, after his residency or his proctorship was over, Dr. Cushing helped pay for him to go to Europe and do research in neuropathology and epilepsy, and Cushing continued to send him money while he was in Europe to help fortify the experience. Dr. Van Wagenen came back here to Rochester, and this was a brand new medical school and a new department of surgery. Many of the faculty of this new department of surgery were from Hopkins because the chair had been at Hopkins and at Yale. And the dean was Harvey Cushing's pathologist from Johns Hopkins. Dr. Van Wagenen was in the early stages of neurosurgery, very few people in the field. Remember, Harvey Cushing had been a general surgeon and didn't make the decision to focus on neurosurgery until he was 5 years into his practice. And Dr. Van Wagenen had many accomplishments, but I think his real passion was education. And he left all of his worldly possessions behind to establish the Van Wagenen Fellowship. And our speaker today, Howard Weiner, was a Van Wagenen Fellow in 1996-97. And he and Barbara, his wife, had a wonderful experience in Paris, and Dr. Weiner really views that as a formative experience in his life. When you look at Howard's career, everywhere he has been an incredible scholar and performer and surgeon, and he went to University of Pennsylvania. He was top in his class at University of Pennsylvania. He won the Polk Prize at Cornell Medical College for the highest academic achievement over 4 years in medical school. Did his residency at NYU, his Van Wagenen Fellowship in Paris, came back to NYU, and over the course of 16, 17 years, went from assistant to associate to full professor with tenure, and then was recruited to Baylor. And at Baylor, beginning in 2016, he was professor and vice chair. He was chief of neurosurgery at Texas Children's Hospital. And, as Melissa would describe it, children from all over the world, come to Texas Children's Hospital for the surgical expertise of Dr. Weiner and the faculty that he's put together. So there are at least 10 clinical faculty in this pediatric neurosurgery program. They are incredibly high achieving, and they are cutting edge in terms of the surgical procedures and the capabilities and volume. And in the midst of all that, Howard's motto is work hard and be nice to people. And as an expression of that, Dr. Lopresti, here's a post of Dr. Lopresti. Dr. Weiner reposted it, but basically it's people working hard, really enjoying the sense of community they have together, doing great things for patients, pushing the field forward, recruiting and training outstanding young surgeons. So it's a real pleasure to have Dr. Weiner here and to have an opportunity to hear his thoughts. And I think we'll start with lessons learned in leadership. And Dr. Weiner, thank you for coming. I think Peter will get us to a safe spot.
Which talk is first? There we go. Great. Thank you so much. Good morning. This is such a huge honor for me and my wife Barbara, and I can't thank you enough for this. And my first time here in Rochester. I have obviously deep connection to Melissa, who was one of our star residents, and we're so proud of her. And to Howard, who we've examined together at the board. I think we've met through the pediatric neurosurgery world, and of course, my new dear friend, Dr. Pilcher, who I think hopefully this will resonate with him and with you. I'm just so impressed with the people here and sort of what you've built and the quality of the people. So I think, this talk I put together, it's hopefully will be interactive, but it's going to be unlike any talk you've ever heard in neurosurgery. It's a bit touchy-feely, which is how I am. I trained at NYU, which is kind of a tough place, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But this is a picture actually taken at the peds section, I think 2 years ago. You know, some of our faculty, some of our fellows, et cetera. But this is one of my gurus. So Danny Meyer, I don't know if any of you have been to New York and you've been to the Union Square Cafe or Gramercy Tavern. He's probably the most successful restaurateur in New York. And we'll talk a little bit about a book that he wrote that when I read it, I said, wow, this is my philosophy of life. And he said this, and I thought it's so profound. He said, business, like life, is all about how you make people feel. It's that simple and it's that hard. And I'm going to talk about this in the context of a career in neurosurgery and how I feel it's helped address certain issues. So, you know, when I round with the medical students and we get a lot of summer students and I try to bring them into the world of neurosurgery, they come to clinic, they come to rounds, and I say, you know, and I happen to like dialectics. So we're doing two things at once, right? We're doing something extremely technical. And as neurosurgeons, you know, obviously it's got to be perfect. We show up every day. You know, my anesthesiologist, Jerry Lax at NY used to say, what does Dr. Weiner say? It's got to be perfect. So we can't have a bad day. We have to show up, and what we do is technical. But we're also doing something extremely human, okay? And we can't forget that. And a lot of times it's easy to forget that. And what I would argue, and sort of my thesis is, whereas technical is super important, the human is slightly more important. And I'm going to show you why. And Danny describes this in two terms, which he calls service versus hospitality. So service is what he calls the technical delivery of a product. So, you know, making a good hamburger, plating the fish, serving the wine in a certain way, doing a good operation. Hospitality, on the other hand, is how the delivery of that service makes the customer feel or makes the patient feel. If somebody feels that you're on their side, that's hospitality. Okay, so you can see, you can start to think how this relates to what we do. And I think this has huge implications. I started thinking about this about 5 years ago. They have a mentoring series in the Department of Surgery at Texas Children's, and they asked me, can I talk about like developing an academic practice in surgery? And I said, well, I can talk about my own experience. And so this sort of thought process developed in the context of that. Like, you know, most of our patients now, certainly in epilepsy, come from outside of the state of Texas. It's something that I've been working hard on for the last 25 years, and I'll talk about that. Managing complications. Okay, we all have complications. It's awful, but how do you go from a situation of a complication to one of a lifelong relationship with that family, where they're on your side? Overcoming challenges. So COVID was a huge challenge. How did we get through COVID? That was a recent challenge, but also going to a new department, starting a new job, you know, flying across the country as the, starting as a chief, as the unknown outsider. I would say in parentheses, unwanted. You know, I came to Texas Children's. I was hired by the Department of Neurosurgery and the hospital leadership, not by the Pediatric Neurosurgery group, who wanted their own person to be the chief there. So how do you get buy-in? How do you build a consensus, and obviously building a great team? So, you know, this is just one of like many, many vignettes, but I'm interested in why patients travel for care. You know, like why would a patient get on an airplane, a family get on an airplane at great cost and great inconvenience, and travel beyond like half a dozen other great departments that have the Rosa robot and the microscope and focused ultrasound and great technical surgeons, and why they would do that. I'm fascinated by that. So this little boy had surgery when I was at NYU. He had a temporal lobe tumor with seizures. We took it out. He did great. We said goodbye. He lived in New Jersey. We saw each other for a few years, and then I lost track of them, and I moved away and they moved away. And then all of a sudden he showed up in my clinic. He was a strapping 16-year-old high school student, totally normal, but he had a seizure out of the blue. And sure enough, a little part of the tumor had recurred deep in the cavity. I was, you know, I'm always struck by what drew them to come all the way back to Texas. And, you know, I'm very proud of the fact that I'm still in touch with a vast majority of my patients. We were talking about this last night, who come, they ask me questions about their healthcare. They invite me to their bar mitzvahs and their weddings. And it brings me great joy, and it's a big part of our career. You know, obviously I love the technical part of neurosurgery, but this really gives me joy. And I think this is a fairly recent note from a child that came from out of state. with a epilepsy-associated brain tumor that we took out. And I just got another note from another family, and you'll note that the comments are very similar. They said, talking about surgical skill, but they also talk about kindness and empathy. So you have these two aspects that I think are very important. This was my first tuberous sclerosis patient. This was a little girl. She was about 11 months old. Dad is a cardiologist turned hedge fund manager from Greenwich, Connecticut. I didn't even know what tuberous sclerosis was at the time. We took out this lesion, very unusual for tuberous sclerosis, single lesion. She did great. They took my address because we had just moved to Westchester County. And on Thanksgiving Day, they called and they showed up at my house, and I thought they were coming to give me a gift basket. They brought their daughter who had an infected wound on Thanksgiving Day. That Thanksgiving, my wife and I will never forget. I drove to the hospital. We took care of her. She now graduated from graduate school. She went to a great college in the Northeast. The dad invited me to be on his professional advisory board for his medical fund. And he was the one who took me and Orrin Davinsky into Ken Langone's office at NYU and said, I want to start a tuberous sclerosis clinic. So how do you get from a disaster, Thanksgiving Day disaster, to that, right? So I try to learn from this. And obviously I'm a big picture person, and I try to get our team, when things are going bad, try to give them a little sense of hope. And I think that this is obviously the first chapter in the Bible, but I think that there's something to this, that no matter how dark it may seem, we know that light will have the last word. We put together this sort of graphic to sort of illustrate the point that, we're all going to have complications, but when you're early in your career and when preventing complications, technical excellence and focus on technique is really important. You have to have confidence, right? To manage complications, however, you have to tap into a more human quality. You have to have humility. You have to learn. You have to ask questions. Early on in the career, it's really important to focus on technical, obviously late in the career too. But as you get older, and once again, I'm talking about a subtle shift. There's a subtle shift where I feel that the human aspect becomes more important. And we're going to go through the what, why, where, and when. So you got a little bit about my background, but I come from very humble roots. My mom grew up in Brooklyn, was a classmate of Barbra Streisand, and my dad was a Holocaust survivor, survived Auschwitz, and they met and they had me. And I showed up at the University of Pennsylvania hoping to be a rock star. My band, the Control Boys, we played in every fraternity for 2 years, every year. I'm in touch with all the band members now. A lot of them are retired attorneys, went to Stanford Law, but you can see the icon in the upper right is a brain. So I was thinking about the brain even back then, and I ended up going to medical school at Cornell, where some of you have been, and that's me playing the bass. One of our, this is an Elvis Costello song. So anyway, I ended up at this place. So when I matched at NYU in 1988, this article came out in Rolling Stone magazine, and it was an expose written by a patient named Steve Fishman who had an AVM, which later became a book called A Bomb in the Brain. And he spent time as a patient in the residency, learning about the residency. And this is the training program I grew up in. This is sort of an image of Joe Ransohoff, who's the legendary chair at NYU for 30 years. And you can see the quote there. It says, it takes 7 years of hellish training to become a brain surgeon, but a cranial commando has to be ready for anything. And this is from the book where he quotes Ransohoff, who basically says, by steadfastly beating the hell out of a resident for half a dozen years, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a wonderful experience. I made lifelong friends. I became the neurosurgeon that I am today based on that experience. But it was a very tough experience, if you will. And I like to joke that probably for about 10 years after my residency, I had PTSD. Not to belittle the diagnosis, but I was not myself. And it probably took me about 10 years to emerge and rediscover the person that I am, sort of the human side of what I did. And at the time, I was very interested in tumors, and I was partnering with Jeff Wissoff, who was a brain tumor surgeon, and we were in the middle of Manhattan. And, you know, there aren't that many tumors in the middle of Manhattan. I had a K award at the time, but I connected with this amazing epileptologist, Orrin Davinsky, and they needed a pediatric epilepsy surgeon. I thought the surgery was amazing. And it just changed my life. I pivoted and got involved in epilepsy surgery, where you spend a lot of time with the patients, you develop these relationships. It's all about collaboration. It's not us versus them. It's we, the epileptologist and the neurosurgeon. And, you know, I had to prove myself to Davinsky to become his surgeon. Or Werner Doyle was our adult surgeon. He wanted to do all the kids. So I had to be really focused on technical excellence. But I was myself, and I was attentive, kind, personal. And I found that a lot of the referrals then would come, you know, by word of mouth and families who had a good experience with me. And I really enjoyed not only the technical part, but the human part of this. And I felt that this was something that developed not only because of my technical focus, but also because of my interest in, you know, connecting with these families. So, you know, I showed you my first tuberous sclerosis patient. We started seeing some of these patients, and I was really interested in this because this broke all the rules of epilepsy surgery, where you know, you look, I will talk about this next talk, but, you know, you're focusing on one area of the brain. These were multiple lesions. These kids were kind of written off from epilepsy surgery. They were sort of left with a life of continued seizures, and it was just awful. And it was a real challenge trying to figure this out. And so, you know, we had this one case, I'll talk about him a little more, where we kind of thought outside the box, and it led to this whole sort of pathway in my career where we wrote about it, stood up, took a lot of heat at national meetings, et cetera, and still very involved with this area. But what really interested me was the story within the story. So this is actually the boy who we published that first case report, the picture up on the top with him. This is when we went back about 8 years after I met him to Pavia, Italy in 2007. They invited Orrin and I to go back and speak. And the mom who advocated for this child, we stayed very connected to her. Just a wonderful human being who was an advocate for her child in an area that we didn't really have a lot of understanding at that time. This is the child about 5 years ago at his graduation from EMT school. He's now employed. He's on one medication. At the time, he had been in the ICU and on drips. And this is the olive oil that they send me in Houston every year as a gift. And I was really struck by this. And of course, when I left NYU after 27 years, you know, 8 as a resident and fellow and 19 on the faculty, it was really emotional for me. And I got a lot of emails and notes. And like the first note that I showed you, they all had the same kind of structure. They would say, thank you so much for taking my child's tumor out. Thank you for taking care of my child's hydrocephalus, et cetera, et cetera. But thank you even more for being a mensch, for being kind, warm, down to earth, not talking down to us, for calling us up at 7 o'clock on Sunday night when you could have been with your little kids. And that I realized that what people remember is that part of what we do. Like, obviously, they want the best. They have to trust us. They want to, you know, we're not talking about being a nice person and an incompetent surgeon, but realizing what the impact that I had was more on the human side. And so, you know, as you heard in 2016, I made a crazy decision to leave a very good situation in New York and move to Texas. And as I said, you know, Melissa may remember some of this, but I was the unknown outsider. How's that going to work? I'm joining Dan Curry, who's a really established epilepsy surgeon. I'm an epilepsy surgeon. How's that going to work? How do you get buy-in? So, you know, once again, I thought about this a lot, and I said, look, I'm going to do what I do naturally. I'm going to focus on the how and the why of what we do rather than the what. I'm going to focus on the human part of the job rather than the technical. I can't teach these folks neurosurgery. I'm going to focus on hospitality versus service, really what we call the soul of pediatric neurosurgery. And we're actually having a session on this at the CNS in Houston in the fall. So, you know, just once again, business like life is all about how you make people feel. It's that simple and it's that hard. So the what, and I added this because I think this is really important. There is this whole field of visualization, right? Like you perceive reality, you know, reality is how you perceive it. And I think this is really important for athletes and for surgeons, but it's also important in terms of the expectations you give your team and the aspirations and vision you give your team. So I like to, not everyone in my department does this, but I like to do all the cases in my head ahead of time. So I work on this virtual reality system and I think about it and I kind of do the operation in my head before we actually do it. So that's one form of think good and it'll be good. I think through all the possibilities, it's going to go great, et cetera, et cetera. But I also wanted to give the team, and I wrote this vision statement for my interview talk. So I had to give a talk at Texas Children's when I was interviewing, and I wrote this vision statement. And really it's become like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Every word chosen in this vision statement is chosen with Talmudic precision. Like, we want to be world-class. You know, they already had an amazing department. They didn't need me to come there and make it any better, but my task was to grow it and make it bigger. So how do you create a destination program? We're going to be world-class. We're going to be innovative. Obviously, quality is super important. We have the US News Survey, which is one measure of quality. But I added the word attentive because I thought that was important. That was going to reflect the things that were important to me in terms of the hospitality side. Obviously, we train the future leaders like Melissa, and we have a robust research program. So this is really interesting. And I saw this, I read this book, I thought it was fascinating. In business, this author argues that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. So why is Apple computers so successful? Apple, obviously they make computers, they make beautiful looking products, but people buy, according to this thesis, people buy Apple products because Apple challenges conventional thinking about everything in life, everything that we do. So I think it's really important to try to work this out. Like, what is your why? People will, when people understand what your why is, it has greater impact. So everybody in our team in pediatric neurosurgery, we want to give them their why. I want to get out of the way and give them their why. I asked my wife, Barbara, like, what's your why? She's like, don't bother me with such silly questions. I don't have a why. Like, you can talk about that with your people. But anyway, I thought it was really fascinating. But I think the part that resonate the most with me, and I think that sets apart our program and sort of the culture that we have, is sort of the how. And you saw this quote, and this poster is an original art poster by a British artist, you can look it up, named Anthony Burrill. I saw it in my sister-in-law's house in Hastings-on-Hudson a number of years ago, and I saw this and I said, this is unbelievable, like something so simple but so hard. It's a life's work. And the first thing I did when I moved to Houston, I bought one, I framed it, put it up on the wall, and it kind of just set the tone for our team and sort of changed the oxygen in the room. And people know that's how we roll, that this is our sort of mantra. And now I buy them every spring. I get 2 copies. I give one out to each of the graduating fellows. I'm very proud to say they've all framed them and hung them up. We've hired 3 fellows and they're all up in their offices. And I don't think they're doing it just to kiss up to me. But I think that it's something that says who we are. And, you know, obviously, as I've gotten older, I've realized this statement by Maya Angelou, it's attributed to her, is so true. And, you know, when I was a resident at NYU, I spent 18 months in the lab, and I knocked on this guy's door, Ed Ziff. Fred Lang was a year ahead of me. We started doing cancer tumor research, and I knocked on Ed Ziff. Ed Ziff was probably the most accomplished scientist at NYU at the time. He was a Howard Hughes investigator. And he, you know, I knocked on his door. I said, I'm starting my research year in like a month. Can I work in your lab? And he said, a month? Like, most people apply 3 years ahead of time to my lab. In any event, Ed turned out to be probably one of the most important influences in my entire life. I would walk into his office as a resident at NYU, feeling beat up and down and really, you know, like, what am I doing wrong, et cetera. And Ed was a scientist. He was a molecular biologist, became a neuroscientist. I have no idea what we talked about. I would go into his office. I have no idea what we talked about, but all I know is that when I came out of meeting with Ed, I was elevated. I felt like a new person. I felt like I could aspire to great things. He was the first person that said to me, wow, you sound really interested by this epilepsy stuff. Why don't you and Oren create this epilepsy center? And he also was the one who connected me with Nicolas Douarin in Paris. So the point is, I have no idea what he said. I have no idea what he did, but I remember how he made me feel. And that's so important in a mentor relationship and something that I carried with me. And this is me and Ed this past Thanksgiving time in New York at the Penn Club. He's retired now. He's a painter and a super special human being. And if you look at culture, we were talking about this tennis last night. If you look at culture at large, people who are technically excellent, but who have a greater impact than just their technical excellence, it's something that's immeasurable. It's something beyond just the technical excellence. There's something about Federer. This is taken from an article in the New York Times, something about how Federer made us feel. And there are a lot of examples about this. We like theater. My son was a drama major at WashU, and he was in a Sondheim production growing up, so I'm a little obsessed with Steve Sondheim, and Merrily Just Won. It was an amazing production on Broadway. Same thing with Stephen Sondheim, probably the most technically gifted composer and lyricist, just brilliant. And yet it's really about how his work makes us feel. And same thing with, Burt Bacharach, an amazing composer, exactly the same thing. And we talked a little about this last night. I don't know Taylor Swift, but I would argue that probably maybe she fits into that category as well. So just to kind of finish up with, what this was all about. So this is the book. I actually probably should get royalties at this point because I've given out probably hundreds of copies. I give them out to all the fellow applicants. So this book was written about 15 years ago, and somebody sent it to me. And when I read it, I'm like, this is 100% my philosophy of life. Not only being a neurosurgeon, but my philosophy of life. And that's a picture of Orrin Davinsky in the white t-shirt and Danny Meyer there. They sent it to me for fun right in front of Shake Shack. So Danny grew up in St. Louis. He was the only person in his family that didn't go to Princeton. He went to Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. And he just spoke at their commencement, by the way. And he was pre-law and he was going to take the LSATs, and he had dinner with his uncle. And he grew up in a family where his dad had this travel company. And they would run these very nice tours of Europe, food and wine tours. So Danny would go abroad, and he got a real taste for fine wine and dining in Rome and Paris. And he had that in him. And he was having dinner with his uncle, and he had this aha moment where he realized, I don't want to be a lawyer. And his uncle said, do what you're passionate about. And he went to work in a restaurant. And, the Union Square Hospitality Group, as I said, is probably the most successful restaurant group in New York. Danny grew up in St. Louis. So, Union Square Cafe, Gramercy Tavern, Maialino, The Modern, Blue Smoke, on and on and on. He's had some failures. So his idea was the no tipping, which was a bust. But he's quite amazing, and to hear him speak. So he grew up in St. Louis, and as a WashU parent, they have Ted Drew's custard that they give out at the convocation. So he was very interested in hamburgers and French fries and custard. And so he wanted to support one of the parks in Lower Manhattan. And so he opened up a little hamburger stand in Madison Square Park to raise money for the neighborhood, and he called it Shake Shack. And now, Shake Shack is in every, so Danny's quite successful, and his business is built on this notion of hospitality. As I told you, service is the technical delivery of a product. In and of itself, according to him, it doesn't make you the customer's favorite, right? But how delivery of that service makes the customer feel, makes the patient feel, makes your colleague feel. If they feel that you're on their side, that's hospitality. So, this is a very powerful thing. And, this is another quote from his book, Hospitality. Any business is the sum of all the thoughtful, caring, gracious thing our staff does to make you feel we're on your side when you're dining with us. He hires on the 51% rule. So he says, and I mentioned earlier that, I feel that the human side is 51%, the technical side is 49%. They're both important. We want to get 100. So he hires on the 51% rule. If you want to work for Danny Meyer, if you want to work at Texas Children's, you have to be technically excellent, but that's only 49%. 51% are all these qualities that he calls the Shake Shack rules. So you have to have these hospitality quotient factors. You have to have optimistic warmth. So you have to be a glass half full person, right? In neurosurgery, it's really critical. You have to have insatiable curiosity, a tremendous work ethic, empathy, integrity, self-awareness, all the things. You can write this list yourself. All the things that you imagine you would want. So if you want to be on his team, you have to have 51% these hospitality quotient skills. So he walks the walk. And, you know, another quote, it's all about soul, and service without soul, no matter how elegant, is quickly forgotten by the patient. And I would say that, you know, our team that we've built, they're all technically excellent neurosurgeons. You know, Texas Medical Center, as Melissa will tell you, is not for the faint of heart, but they're even better as human beings. We're all different, but everybody's got the same core values. Danny also is famous for saying the customer comes second. So I wouldn't go so far to say the patient comes second. I trained under Pat Kelly. I would never say that, but you get the idea. The idea is if the team feels that you're on their side, and I'm sure you feel that in this department from my early experience here, it's clearly how this department rolls. The patients feel it. The patients see that the team is jazzed and they're excited to be at work. Another interesting book by the same author. So I like dialectics. So as neurosurgeons, as healthcare providers, we're doing two things. We're, you know, doing the US News, and, you know, we want to balance the budget. We want to have no complications. We're doing something very focused, right? But we're also doing something much more than that. So, you know, our team, we're playing the second game, right? So this game is the infinite game. So we're playing the finite game and we're also playing this infinite game. If the team feels that we are doing something greater than just, you know, running the list, and then I think that the patients feel it, right? And it's better for everybody. You can take a picture of this. I'm not going to go through it. It's a really profound quote. I'm not a huge Bruce Springsteen fan. I've become more of a fan in life. But, you know, I mentioned Dan Curry. Dan Curry's a brilliant partner. I love him. You know, we'll talk about him in my next talk. But, you know, I came in as an epilepsy surgeon. He's an epilepsy surgeon. How's that going to work? You know, managing that relationship. And what I would say now is that the way I describe my relationship with Dan Curry is 1 + 1 = 3. Like, we're synergistic. It's not about ego. It's about, and the way Bruce Springsteen sort of describes, you know, a band. And this is sort of my concept of a team, that, you know, there's a synergy, there's a magic that's created. You know, 1 + 1 = 2 is sort of like everyday life. 1 + 1 = 3 is sort of special, you know, and that's the essential equation of art and rock and roll, and I think neurosurgery. If I had to distinguish one quality, so I thought about this a lot, one quality that distinguishes our team, I would say it's that everybody in our team is a giver. Okay, and what do I mean by that? So the takers is givers and takers. The takers are easy to spot, right? The takers are like, look at me, it's all about me, I need, I want. The givers, on the other hand, when we had our 2 Austin new faculty come, and they trained in Houston for 4 months before we sent them off to our new hospital in Austin, I'll never forget what Dr. Patel said. She was in the OR with Mina Vessel. They were doing a huge tumor case for the first time together, working out as a team. And she told me that in sequence, every one of our faculty members walked into the room and peeked over and said, do you need any help? Are you okay? How you doing? Do you want me to scrub in, et cetera? So she was kind of blown away by that. The other thing is, if we have a problem with the call schedule, I can't even get on the text group, the group text, fast enough before everybody says, oh, I'll take it. You know, I learned last night that there are no divorces in this department, which is a huge positive statistic. And I think that this idea of being a giver, I heard this when I was early in my marriage, that, you know, a blissful relationship is one where the 2 partners are only focused on what they can give to the other partner, rather than what is owed to me, that would be an incredible thing if people only focused on that. And of course, the secret to life, you know, and I like this artist, is you get what you give, right? You know, there are a lot of quotes like this. The Beatles said it, but, you know, the more you give, the more you get. It's the paradox, but it's really the secret of life. And I think that, you know, people learn this lesson at different points of their life. Interestingly, another quote from the Times, I thought this was fascinating. Wellness is a huge thing now. I'm on the wellness committee of the ASPN, and this was a really interesting study where they looked at almost 50,000 workers, and they were evaluating these wellness programs in businesses, and they found that they didn't work and they were actually counterproductive. But the only thing that really gave the workers a sense of well-being was being a giver, giving charity or doing volunteer work. So there's definitely something to this. And, you know, in the end, Danny said, and this is another quote from the magazine article, your favorite restaurant is invariably the one that loves you the most. We want to be the patient's favorite, right? We want to create a destination program where patients will travel. That was the mantra and the charge I was given by Mark Wallace, the CEO of Texas Children's. So, you know, I think this is a profound quote. It seems very simple-minded, but, you know, obviously, and this is the inside of the new Union Square Cafe. They moved it from Union Square up to Park Avenue South. I highly recommend it. You know, this has a lot of implications, right? They talk about customer obsession at Texas Children's. I talk about colleague obsession. This is good, obviously, for Press Ganey, for practice building, obviously for medical legal. And, you know, the concept is be yourself. You know, we've grown tremendously. I can say that, you know, our tumor and epilepsy volumes have doubled. We've increased, you know, over 40%. We do, you know, close to 1,300 cases now with 7 attendings. This was last year. I would say that patient, you know, hospitality is not the main driving force, but I would say, you know, patients want to be here, you know, with us. Fellows want to be with us. People want to work with us. So I think it definitely is having some impact. And this is a quote that I think says it all. Mark Wallace, when I gave him the book, he sort of outlined this. And, you know, understanding the distinction between service and hospitality has been at the foundation of our success. Service is the technical delivery of a product. Hospitality is how the delivery of that product makes its recipient feel. Service is a monologue. We decide how we want to do things and set our own standards, right? Sounds like neurosurgery. Hospitality, on the other hand, is a dialogue. To be on a guest side requires listening to that person with every sense and following up with a thoughtful, gracious, appropriate response. It takes both great service and great hospitality to rise to the top. So I'm going to just finish off here with time to talk, but I run this mentoring committee for the ASPN, and I get asked a lot, like, what are your thoughts about mentoring? And there's a lot to say about that. There are books written, there are manuals written, but I just wanted to leave the residents some of my thoughts. And I think a lot of these ideas you've seen, you know, I've learned from your amazing faculty and team here, but probably the most important thing I say is be yourself. So, you know, everybody's unique and special, and we need to celebrate the unique and special nature of everybody on the team. I have to give Dan Yosher tremendous credit for bringing me to Texas and letting me be myself and letting me put that poster up and, you know, sort of change the oxygen in the room in a way that spoke to me. A great team is made up of role players. Everybody in our team in pediatric neurosurgery is different. We like different music, we have different religions, different training, different parts of the country, but we have the same core values of what we believe in, and that's basically being a giving person. I talked a little bit about my pivot from being, you know, a brain tumor researcher to being an epilepsy surgeon, and I think it's really important to marry your passion and interests with what the needs are in the environment. And that's sort of the secret combination is, you know, if you want to be an epilepsy surgeon, but there's one neurologist in the room, you know, who's not surgically minded, you know, it's not going to work. So look around you and understand what your calling has been. I tell, you know, the residents this, obviously you want to publish a lot, you want to fill up your CV, and you want to be curious and contribute. You want to leave neurosurgery better than you found it. But, you know, discover your why. Your CV should tell a story. You know, everybody wants their why. And I think everybody in our team who's subspecialty focused within pediatric neurosurgery is really driving from their why. You know, I mentioned mentors and role models. This is extremely important. I talked about Ed Ziff. This is Danny with Oren Davinsky. We talked about this in the car this morning. I get this sense here, go big or go home. This is a really interesting email that I pulled out from 1998. So I don't know if any of you have heard of George Ankopoulos, but at the time I was working in Ed Ziff's lab as a new faculty member, and I was cloning tyrosine kinase receptors from pediatric brain tumor tissue. And I started reading basic science journals, and I read Cell, and every month there was an article by this young MD PhD from Columbia named George Ankopoulos, who was working at Regeneron. I'm like, I'm going to work with this guy. So I emailed him and said, hey, I want to collaborate, and he invited me up, and it was great. As a footnote, he's probably one of the wealthiest MDs now. He's on the list of MD billionaires. He's number two at number two at Regeneron. But the point is, you know, and Nicole Ladouarin in Paris and Ed Ziff, these are all big people. And don't be afraid to go big or go home. We're neurosurgeons. Obviously, I've learned a lot about the department here. If I didn't get up and run on the bayou every morning and then go to synagogue and then study with Rabbi Rovner every night, I don't know what I would do. The day would not be the same. This is a band, Luna, that I love, that Dean Wareham, second from the right, is went to Harvard College, and we're friends. And anyway, I think whatever that is, it's very important. Focus on family and friends. I don't have to tell this audience, but I heard an amazing, I read an amazing thing when I was a young parent 25 years ago in New York. I'm sure people have heard of him. There was a candidate who ran for office, I think governor and then senator, named Rick Lazio. And I can't find this quote anywhere, but I know I read it in the paper. And it sort of changed my life at the time, because I was running and ambitious and I wanted to do. And he said the following. He said, he was running for office and then he dropped out, and people asked him, why did you drop out of running for office? And he was, people were cynical about it, but he said this quote that really stuck with me. He said, we all go out every day. He was going to spend time with his family. We all go out every day to sort of change the world, to save the world. But if I wasn't a good father, what good would it all be? And I thought about that, and, I'm very proud that, that relationship was very important. I spent the time that I needed to spend. So don't forget about the people that are going to be with you at the very end. This is the end. This was a case I did with Jacob Leopard when he was fellow about 2.5 years ago. This was an IDH mutant glioma in a teenager. And we took this out without an SMA syndrome, and he did great. He had a beautiful looking MRI, and he went home. And about 6 weeks later, I ran into one of my neighbors in Houston who's a builder, and he said, "Oh, I met this dad of a patient of yours. They absolutely love you." They were going on and on about how great you are. And it was the dad of this patient. And what my friend did not know is that this patient came back 2 weeks after surgery with a serratia infection of the wound, and we had to operate, and it was a mess. And he's doing great now. But my point is, like at the beginning, how do you go from that situation to a father saying, "We love Dr. Weiner," et cetera? So complications will happen. They lead to growth. This is a really, really, I think, profound quote. Let's see if I can move this out of the way. It says, "A righteous man falls 7 times, but rises again. Fools believe." The intent of the verse is to teach us that the righteous man falls 7 times, and despite this, he rises. But the knowledgeable are aware that the essence of the righteous man's fall, rising again, is because of his 7 falls. So you need to take a few knocks to rise up in neurosurgery. Let's see, last slide. And I'll end with this. We found a picture of Dan Curry smiling in the archive, so I put it in my talk. Dan is one of my closest friends and colleagues. He's a brilliant neurosurgeon. This is the dialectic of the neurosurgeon. We live on this fulcrum of ego and humility, right? So this was a famous quote from the 18th century. "Everyone should have 2 pockets, each containing a piece of paper. And one pocket should be a piece of paper that says, 'I am but dust and ashes,'" quote from Genesis. "And the other pocket should be a piece of paper that says, 'For my sake was the world created.'" Periodically, we need to reach into either one pocket or the other to read the message. The key is knowing when to reach into each. So that's the life we live as neurosurgeons. When you go into the OR, you have to feel like it's all me. Obviously, you're working with a team, but you have to have the confidence to do that. But you also have to know when to stop and when to pull back. So on that note, this boy that came to Houston, that flew to Houston from out of state, obviously they had to trust us. They had to know we were going to do a technically excellent job. But in the end, what they remembered were these things. Even if this feels a little touchy-feely for you, just remember that details are important in neurosurgery, and I'm a real stickler for details. So don't be fooled by the touchy-feely nature of this talk. Thank you so much. So I'm sure that's going to generate a lot of questions. I'd love to hear what people's thoughts. Yes, Dr. Pilcher.
If you were, and I think Ed Bates would agree with me, if you took a bucket of old school neurosurgeons, you might put Pat Kelly, Joe Ransohoff, Charlie Wilson in that bucket, right? And so, I think you might describe to the residents what that was like, and the impact of that training on your journey and getting to where you are today.
Yeah, so old school neurosurgery was, as Dan Curry says, it's not about feelings. But I would say if I dig deeper and deeper and deeper, there was a humanity there that would manifest itself. But yeah, old school training, the conferences were wild. There was, cigarette smoking, cursing, beating each other up. And I think there's value to that. Sometimes we say at our M&M conference at Texas Children's, like, let's go, we gotta pull in some of that old school stuff too. But there's also a lot of bad there. And I think that, it's sort of like parenting. I think that you don't want to go too far in not setting standards and not setting rules. But I think we've evolved, and we've evolved for much better. Those guys were incredibly talented leaders who obviously made neurosurgery what it is, and I learned so much from them. But in many ways, it was very much all about them, and leading by the iron fist. And I'm a product of that, and I think there was definitely value. But I'm encouraged by the fact that I can still be myself, and we can still be more human and not compromise on the other stuff. So that's the point. The point is not to, it's not a choice. And some patients don't care. I mean, I had, there was a famous heart surgeon at NYU who people just wanted his hands. They didn't care if he came to see them post-op, and I get that, but I think the old school neurosurgery lives on in us. And I think there are messages that will live on forever, in terms of devotion to the craft, devotion to the patient, devotion to leaving neurosurgery better than you found it. I mean, so many quotes from Pat Kelly, but yeah, I mean, that's my understanding of it. And I'm sure people who trained in that era would feel the same way. I don't know if that's answering your question. Yes, sir.
This may sound cynical, but it strikes me that if you don't have an infrastructure of people working with you to make sure that you're having interactions where you are truly needed, then somebody who is as generous and humane as you are is going to get taken advantage of a lot by patients who don't have a real problem, or who can't accept the fact that their problem is solved. And if you're willing to give an hour and a half in clinic to everybody who wants an hour and a half of your time, then,
It's a great question. Yeah. So I totally agree with that. What I'm speaking about here is more of a philosophy. It's not a methodology, so I agree with you. I have 25 patients in clinic. I got to move, I'm not going to get the top Press-Ganey score because even though I'm nice, I'm rushing through it. I got to get through the day. I got to do an add-on case. So I hear you. And I think it's more of a philosophic and stylistic approach that speaks to what are our values, like what are our values, not like how we run our day. I think that, if you came to Texas Children's, it's like incredibly busy place. We have our morning meeting, and I think it's important to have structure and communication. But I think that the things that really stop me in my tracks in clinic are some of these experiences, like when I have a patient that we have that connection, or they're graduating from clinic, I'm not going to see them again. I have to take a pause, and it's a human moment. I think that the team feels it, and I think it's really important in building collaborations. So rather than an us versus them approach to the outside services in the world, it's really like, you can come to neurosurgery, so people want to work with us. And I think it helps, like running a division. Obviously, I don't run a department like this, but we're sizable for peds, and to get things that you want for the team, knowing how to ask, when to ask, who to ask. Nisha Gadgil, who's incredible, she'll be a star one day. She may be, the next chief at TCH for all I know. She's amazing, and she spends a lot of time with me, and she says, I see how you get, you know, when you need to get things, how you get it, you know, so I still have a lot of the NYU in me, but I think that for me, as I've gotten older, I've become more comfortable expressing these values, and I think it's important to give that over, you know, and that's sort of the style of pediatric neurosurgery that I wanted to, that's why I moved to Houston, really. So, but I hear you. I mean, yeah, you could easily get stepped on, taken advantage of without the proper.
This may be splitting hairs, or perhaps it's a Talmudic obsession. You know, service versus hospitality. Within medicine, we talk about service, and certainly for our admissions committee in the medical school, we emphasize the idea of service, not using the word hospitality, the idea that you will put the interests of others above your own. And it, you know, it has an even deeper root in the Greek word oikos, which is that idea of caring for the stranger, and how that was the primary rule that Zeus established, that you have to care for that other person. You cannot treat that person in a mean way. And, you know, looking back in Greek mythology, the idea that you always have to care for the stranger. If you are rude to them, then the gods will be rude to you. I think it's important, and I think it feeds into that idea that, you know, we need to create that space and that generosity for patients, because medicine is about putting the interests of others above your own.
100%. I couldn't have said it any better. I totally agree with that. And that's sort of, you know, another way of saying being a giver, like in other words, giving of oneself. And 100%, like that's a career in neurosurgery is all about thinking about others before you think of yourself. I couldn't have said it. It's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. I would say that I spoke at Hopkins, and I think that, you know, the amount that I know about Henry Brem, I would say he kind of embodies this philosophy. And, you know, obviously Dr. Pilcher, you know, we're now friends. I mean, it's very clear to me that, you know, this is his philosophy.
Well, it's interesting, you know, the word oikos is also the root of the word economics, that, you know, if you are kind to others, it brings profit onto you.
That's a Danny Meyer philosophy. Yeah, for sure. So, but it's not, I mean, I think if you go work in the world of finance, you know, I mean, I have kids in their late 20s, and, you know, it's not like this, you know, it's like old school neurosurgery. So, anyway, I don't know, any other comments? I mean, residents or anybody, like, you know, does this, it's not a typical neurosurgery talk.
How do you eliminate the culture of competitiveness? Because it seems, I'm really impressed by what you say about Curry.
Yeah.
Is he the person who they internally wanted to elevate to?
No, it was somebody else. It was actually Andrew J. Andrew J was their guy, and he ended up leaving, and I'm friends with Andrew, and you know, it's all good. But
But also, when you're recruiting other people, you talked about we're a team of role players.
Yeah.
Like, is that something you specifically select against when you're screening people to add to your faculty?
no, I think it's more important the person. You know, like obviously the first thing is technical skill. You know, that's a given. So there has to be that as a given. And then the second thing is character. And everything else to me is commentary. Like, you know, if you haven't written 200 papers, like I'll give you an example. Guillermo Aldave, that's a perfect example. He came in as an international fellow. He arrived like a couple months before I did in 2016. His chair in Spain, he came from Pamplona, Spain. He was at University de Navarra. He trained there, and his chair knew Ray Sawaya, who was at Baylor and MD Anderson. Ray's phenomenal. Ray embodies this. So Guillermo was there, and I was the new guy. So they stuck him with me, and he was married with 3 kids, and his wife was a physician, and he was working like resident hours and getting paid resident salary. I think he had been a junior attending in Spain. And they stuck him with me, and I was like, this guy is unbelievably talented and the most wonderful human being. And so first thing I did was make him a second fellow. Then we were meeting, Sandy Lamb, me, Dan Curry, Bill Whitehead, met in my apartment at the time before my wife moved there. We were having pizza and beer and trying to figure out, I had this idea, like, we do, 200 brain tumors a year, like, we need to, now, we need a brain tumor, specialist. We're our brain tumor center. And I wanted to have somebody in, like, I wanted that to be a thing. And so, okay, which fellow are we gonna hire from here, there, or the other? We looked at all the fellows from all the top places. And I said something at that pizza dinner. I said, what about Guillermo? Guillermo's an MD PhD. He loves tumors. He's technically amazing. And Bill Whitehead, to his credit, Bill Whitehead is extremely discerning, said, Guillermo's perfect. We hired Guillermo. Guillermo's now associate chief of the service. He was just promoted with tenure to associate professor. He got us recognized by the North American Skull-Based Society as the first pediatric center of excellence. He's got, now patients are flying in from all over. He's doing all these inoperable tumors. I sent him to Dan Yosher's office to interview when we were hiring him as faculty, and he came back almost in tears because Dan said to him, where's your NIH grant? You don't have 200 papers. You didn't go to Harvard. What are you doing in my office? And Guillermo came back like, oh my God, I'm going back to Spain. But a year later, Dan Yosher said, this was the best recruit we ever had. He's an amazing surgeon, a great human being, and ambitious. So you talk about ambition, like ambition's really important, being competitive. I'm like super competitive person, but you have to be ambitious for the right reasons, right? So everybody in the team is ambitious for the patient, for the group, for neurosurgery in general. They want to make neurosurgery better. The minute it gets over the line where it's like all about me, look at me on Twitter, look at what I've done, that's where I get a little uncomfortable. So with Dan Curry, it's about ego, being an intact ego and saying like, I'm gonna help bring the patients in. I'm gonna let him be the lead and get all the respect and glory and be the guy. And I'm just gonna help that and add where I can add. And it's worked out really well. And once people realize what your character and values are, then it just clicks. So now we have total buy-in. Everybody's like very happy there and trusts me. And I think that's my point, like revealing that aspect, I think was very important in terms of managing. So everybody in the team is super ambitious, and not a lightweight, but we have a certain system where, Melissa can talk about it, but it's where I'm very proud of the character of the group. So if that answers your questions. Anyway.
Thank you.
Nelson.
Peter will set up your next talk. Your marathon.
Yeah. I run to the restroom quickly or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Message.
Yeah.
What's his next talk? Anybody?
It's
Panama or Rochester?
Yes, it's a capital.
that's it. Yeah, the third one.
Yes.
You like this?
Sure.
This was your.
I'll get around to this maybe later. I've got for clear where you want to go, what yeah, go ahead.
How is your on the lake?
Okay.
Can they? It's always spend time there.
Thank you. It's not bad. It takes a moment to just.
Does it take a lot of effort? Yes. It's a set. Right. Which is not very real.
No, that won't be. It'll cost almost as much as the house.
And just in terms of choreography, much time will be spent in Florida in the summer.
In the summer?
Yeah.
I'm gonna go down one week just because there's a wedding down there. There's a wedding, yeah.
Other wedding, right?
It'll be the neighbor.
Is
Right.
is
Good to have her.
the patient or the mom?
I'll try to use.
The mom is okay. Yeah. Can you do me a favor, Jeff? Either I'm the global, just send me an email with her name and contact. And we'll work out a way to get in. It's just unfortunate. I mean, our whole department, me personally, but our whole department is, we have 2 new faculty members starting to shoulder. We're just, we don't. But yeah, I can pull people out and move it around and try to help her along.
Yeah.
And then hopefully, which is overall, we need to clear our backlog, but yeah, I know that is our overwhelming biggest challenge.
See a patient.
Just get
Patient has measurable blast.
Yeah, so just send me her email and you can let her know. Figure it out later.
Since they've been there, I haven't really got it.
Did they get?
No problem. Yep, take care, John.
I don't know where those things go. I mean, hey, at first I offered to clean it right away. He said, well, let us get settled. Oh, really? But I think it's been long enough. But the other thing, which I do really is, what are they doing with Baylor? Where is that going? Is that going upstate? All right, thanks. Is that going? I mean, she's. That, I think that's also, they're not. Hey. So, yeah, right.
Yeah, 2-year-old. That kid's just transferred.
I'm so glad, that's great, yeah.
Because eventually, there's some goal is. So the first clinics, to do some follow clinics, then she was doing clinics. I need acute care side. Neurology. ABC 7. Some special deal.
Hi, should I start?
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you again. This is once again a huge honor. We're going to shift gears now a little bit and talk about. I mentioned I didn't really start off as an epilepsy surgeon, but I was drawn to it and love it and got involved in this tuberous sclerosis. So we'll talk a little bit about it. So nothing to disclose. I just wanted to thank you again for this tremendously kind invitation. It's a huge honor for me, and I will always remember it. And so proud of Melissa. So happy that she's here, and look forward to hearing great things. And thank you, Dr. Pilcher, Dr. Silverstein. Thank you for being such kind friends. Obviously, this is a very storied department with a tremendous history, and it's such an honor to be here. I just mentioned very quickly the Van Wagenen Fellowship. We talked a little bit about it last night. It was really one of the best times of our life. We were a young couple. We had 6-month-old twins. We were married for about 5 or 6 years at that point. And we made lifelong friends and, you know, it was our first adventure and it allowed us to take our second adventure to Texas. Pat Kelly was the one that really got me interested in the Van Wagenen Fellowship. He said that he had done it and why don't I apply? And it was one of the best things that I ever did. And then we had two subsequent Van Wagenen fellows. Steve Russell was a resident at NYU. Uzma trained at Penn, but came on faculty briefly and was a Van Wagenen fellow. This was the woman I worked with. She was probably one of the most senior scientists in France, Nicole Ledouarin, Madame Ledouarin. She was she was a really tough boss. And I think this is a bit inaccurate. When I was there, she had over 1,000 published papers. She had this beautiful mansion in the middle of the Bois de Vincennes, this forest east of Paris, where the lab was. And she was famous for inventing this chick quail chimera, where they would take chick embryo, remove it, and transplant in quail embryo. And you could follow the nuclear pattern, staining pattern of the quail tissue, and you could do fate mapping experiments. And then once molecular biology came in, that really transformed it. And of course, we loved Paris. This was the street we lived on. We lived 99 Rue Quincampoix in the Troisième. And this is a younger version of me with my 6-month-old twins in their side-by-side stroller. This is my wife on the left with her friend Caroline Shapiro, who lives in England with our twins. That's my chubby son Noah, who's like thin as a rail now. And that's my daughter Hannah, who's married. And this is the twins again. It was a magical time. This was the lab in the middle of the forest. I would go running at lunchtime throughout the forest. It was great. And I got paired up with this postdoc, Angra Penn, who spoke English. So that was helpful to me. She went on to do a postdoc at Harvard and has her own lab in Europe now. And we worked together, and I got a paper in mechanisms of development for my time there. And this was some of my experiments. I was grafting rhombomer 1 and 2, which was supposed to be cerebellum, and grafting it into the lower rhombomers and looking at the fate. And he was great. And then I ended up in New York for most of my life. And as I told you, I moved to this place in 2016. And like the city of Houston, Texas Children's very young. It started off as this small sort of side branch of St. Luke's Hospital. It's become this massive enterprise now. This is already an old picture. There are probably like 10 buildings, and it keeps growing. We have a hospital in North Houston and Woodlands in West Houston and Katy, and we just opened a hospital in Austin. And you saw this picture. This is our team now. We're still growing. We're going to add more faculty. So this talk is really also like a concept talk. And in the time that I've been doing this since, I finished fellowship in 97, this field has exploded. And so many people want to do this. I feel like a lot of the fellows that apply, they want to do epilepsy surgery. I also want to introduce this notion of what are we targeting as surgeons? Do we target a focus, or, now we hear a lot about networks. And obviously in peds, not everyone's going to have a temporal lobe tumor that's going to be seizure-free post-op. We have to moderate our expectations of outcome based on the increased pathologies that we're taking on. So really there's been two. There's been a philosophical advance and there's been a technical advance in this field. And I would argue that every child that has refractory epilepsy is a surgery candidate. So, it's not, the question is not who's a candidate. The question is who's not a candidate. And that's where we are now. That's the huge change that has occurred. And we know now that, and this was not always the case, but patients, when I was starting out, they were referred to me when they were teenagers after a big developmental window had already passed. And now we know that epilepsy is not good. And our patients are now 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 6 months old, 5 months old. There is this notion, even many of our neurologists that we work with, afraid of surgery. We know it's safe. It has the same track record as the rest of neurosurgery for that matter. And kids are great patients, right? They can recover. Their ability to recover from a hemiparesis is much better than adults. And so they are great patients, and we have a lot more leeway than we do in our adult patients. And everybody that comes through Texas Children's gets a very standardized package of pre-surgical workup. All these evaluations are there to sort of give us a sense of where to go. And epilepsy surgery for many of our patients is staged. So the pre-surgical workup is called, phase 1, and the diagnostic surgery where we put electrodes in the brain, that's phase 2. We've gone from grids to stereo EEG, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then the actual surgery is either resection, disconnection, hemispherotomy. I'll show some videos in this talk and the next talk. But I joined Dan Curry, who invented the idea of using laser for epilepsy, which has really caught on, and there's definitely a role for that. And of course, neuromodulation, which is the hot thing now, RNS and DBS. So, basically we want to know where to go in the brain, and then we want to ask, is it safe to operate in that area of the brain, right? And obviously, as I mentioned, with epilepsy surgery, we have a lot of points of contact with these patients. So they come in, we meet with them. Sometimes they're in the hospital getting a workup for long periods of time. We get to develop relationships. Everything is discussed at a conference. I don't see a patient and say, okay, we're going to do this, that, or the other. We meet, they get presented at we have 2 conferences. We have a triage conference on Wednesdays, and we have a pre-surgical conference on Tuesdays, which are really important. So, we want to know where to go in the brain. We want to correlate the EEG, MRI, and the clinical features, which are important. And all these other advanced studies are really to give us a sense. They're surrogates of epileptic activity. So in an epilepsy focus, metabolism will be down, blood flow will be increased during a seizure. So, we use all of these to sort of hone in on where we need to go. And this, this is an old study now, but basically showing that surgery has a beneficial role over medicine for this entity of mesial temporal sclerosis, which is interestingly has been decreasing in incidence. But we know that there's definitely a role for surgery. We're redoing this study now. This study was published in 2008, but in 2004, we participated in this where we gave data, and this was a survey of what's the snapshot of pediatric epilepsy in the world in 20 years ago. And this was all lesional epilepsy, tumors, cavernomas, hemispheric pathology, very small use of intracranial electrodes, like very different. Like I would say 80% or more of our patients have electrodes now. And the patients were older, and it was one focus in the brain, right? We know that there's still lots of cases where we have that situation, but tuberous sclerosis will illustrate, and now we know that the epilepsy can be more complicated, and yet we can still help these kids. So it gets to this notion of, this was something very interesting to me, like as a simple surgeon, yeah, I'm going in to take that lesion out, but we know epilepsy is a network. So what is it? And I told you I like dialectics. I think it's both, right? So I think we need to know the network, understand the network for prognosis, for outcome prediction. But really what we do in surgery is really a focused resection. And I think if you look at the history of epilepsy surgery, it's really interesting to see this debate kind of play out virtually, historically. The idea of the network, just so you know, is that, Susan Spencer wrote about this, and you alter anywhere in the network and it will affect the network in general. So we're not really interested in a lesion or anything like that. So, it's a really a radically different concept of the brain. And if you look at what we take care of, it's really kind of clear that a lot of the epilepsies that we treat, that we consider focal, as Dennis Spencer said, are more distributed. So if you do an evaluation of these patients with some of these studies, there is a complex network going on. And the focus that we have to find, which is our job to find as surgeons, is elusive. It's occult, it's hidden. And yet you have to find that focus. This debate, it's really interesting to read this. I got this book as a gift from Warren Davinsky at one of the epilepsy dinners, Penfield's book, and of course, the Talarak school. And these were radically different. So Penfield obviously was interested in interictal intraoperative recordings. He was interested in a focus, like a traumatic focus. He recorded spikes acutely and used ECOG, and they were interested in the lesion. Whereas by contrast, the Talarak school and Dr. Kelly did his Van Wagenen fellowship with Talarak.
They were interested in the network and ictal recordings, chronic recordings. They used this technique called stereo EEG, which was frame-based, and they would put electrodes in orthogonally with digital subtraction angiography. And they were interested in this working hypothesis, this electroclinical anatomic correlation, and the lesion was really less interesting to them. But, you know, once again, if you look at the literature, and we have a prospective study in the PEDS world that came out a few years ago from India, which basically shows the same thing. If you look at what we're doing in the world, we're still looking at foci rather than network. And if you look at the pathologies that we're treating, I'm going to talk a little bit about tuberous sclerosis, but other pathologies that are more diffuse, polymicrogyria, MRI negative, where our technology can't even pick up the pathology, we're dealing with a focus within a network. Tuberous sclerosis is really fascinating. I had very little knowledge of this as a resident. I remember when Dr. Louis Shute came from CHOP and he questioned me about this, and I didn't really know about it. We see these patients in two ways. They have epilepsy, which is thought to be due to the cortical tubers. They also have these subependymal nodules, which are really more diagnostic in a young child that comes to the ER and has calcified subependymal nodules. That may be diagnostic. And then they can get these benign brain tumors that, you know, we used to take out, but now shrink if you take an mTOR inhibitor. So the surgery for these has really gone down. And as I said earlier, you know, this is fascinating to me because as opposed to having one focus in the brain, which is sort of how we were taught about epilepsy surgery, these children can have multiple lesions, and they were kind of written off as surgical candidates. So this is a really good example to me of a focal pathology within a potentially larger network. Now, we do have these single cases. I showed you one example in the last talk. There's another example, which I call focus dominant. These are kids who have one single lesion. You can take it out without much monitoring or without much fuss. And that's definitely the patients that were having surgery early on in the literature. But the patients that we're seeing in clinic really are this category. These are the complicated patients that I call network dominant. These patients have EEGs that suggest multifocality, bilaterality. Their MRIs look like this. And these kids were not having surgery. Okay, so, you know, Pat Kelly, as you would imagine, at the Mayo Clinic, operated on these kids like they were brain tumors. So he published an early series with Martina Bebin and Manny Gomez, who was, you know, one of the early codifiers of TS, treating these single unifocal lesions as brain tumors. And when I got into this field, we were using strips and grids. So we would do craniotomies to really refine what we were doing. And, you know, this is a field I don't have to mention this room that started, you know, in Seattle and in Connecticut, you know, the use of subdural grid electrodes, which is really sort of the American school of how to do this. And, you know, we have a number of criteria for, you know, how we use grids and how we use it in tuberous sclerosis. And we still have many examples of this where we'll place a grid, or historically we would place a grid and do mapping in that fashion. And it's just one example. Now, the network dominant patients, which in my experience are the majority of patients, when I finished my training in 1997, this article came out from the Montreal Neurological Institute, see Rasmussen's name. And their approach was that, you know, with focal tuberous sclerosis, they would undergo surgery, but if they were multifocal, you could only palliate with a corpus callosotomy or, you know, a vagal nerve stimulator. But these patients were essentially written off. And we started seeing these patients, and I mentioned that boy from Italy, which we published early on, where this was sort of an aha moment for us, that realizing that this was really focal epilepsy, that we could consider this multifocality as really lesional, and that we could think outside the box. And we started seeing a lot of these patients who would not meet the criteria for epilepsy surgery, and we would study them with, at the time, we didn't have stereo EEG, so we'd use subdural grids, subdural strips, depth electrodes, as you can see, to kind of identify, okay, what's the hot focus? What's the hot tuber? And, you know, one of the early papers, we basically said, you know, multiple or bilateral foci are not necessarily a contraindication to surgery. And that was kind of a very radical idea. And I think it kind of opened the floodgates a bit in terms of patients. And we would approach it with this subdural grid approach. It was really hard to do that because, you know, this is big surgery, multiple craniotomies. I did a strip survey that I learned from Werner Doyle, who learned from Dennis Spencer. We do these 2 trough craniotomies and a vertex craniotomy and put lots of electrodes in and try to figure out where the hot tuber was and what the focus was. Then, as I mentioned, in 2016, I moved from New York to Texas. At NYU, we did not have stereo EEG, right? So that was something that had developed at the Cleveland Clinic, as I'll mention, but I joined the brilliant Dan Curry, who was already doing stereo EEG for a number of years. And now we barely use grids. The only time I use grids at this point is really for functional mapping. And as we know, stereo EEG started in Europe, Talerac, the French school and the Italian school. And this was a big, big change when it was brought over to the Cleveland Clinic early in the 2000s. And there has not been, or there are few radical shifts in neurosurgery as radical as this, where now everybody pretty much, certainly in the peds world, is doing stereo EEG instead of subdural grids. So that was a radical change. Obviously, there are a lot of advantages to stereo EEG. I think that one thing that I always emphasize with families is that stereo EEG is not, it's minimally invasive, it's not non-invasive. You can have lots of complications with stereo EEG if you're not careful, but that has become the phase 2 study of choice. And when I originally presented this at some of the meetings at the Cleveland Clinic, stereo EEG, it sounds like perfect for tuberous sclerosis. We don't have to do multiple craniotomies. We can steer the robot anywhere we want and really understand which is the hot tuber or the region. And they kind of laughed at me and said, this is not what stereo EEG was developed for. But nevertheless, we started doing it. And so now we're seeing these patients, we've treated, I don't know, probably close to 250 patients now with both focus dominant and network dominant tuberous sclerosis. And I'll talk a little bit about that because I think our approach is somewhat different. The key here is that we see everybody for who they are. We talk about them at conference, and then we decide how to approach these patients. So I'm going to show you a few examples. We still have these patients. This is a girl. She was probably about 2 years old, had this large calcified lesion in a cluster, basically an entire right frontal lobe of tubers. And the decision here was made to just do a motor-sparing frontal lobectomy on the right side, which we did. And once again, in the era of minimally invasive surgery and laser ablation, there's still a beauty to neurosurgery. This video that I'm going to show you is, this will come out next month in JNS focus video, basically a subpeel technique for removing a large cluster of tubers. This is the interhemispheric fissure. You can see we're holding the PN. These are removed en bloc. So basically a tuber, it's described as a potato, but really is, I call it like a head of broccoli or cauliflower. It's an entire region of the brain that's involved. These are lesions that grow within the pia. And, basically these are removed subpeally. Using a combination of, microdissection as well as the cavitron or the sonopet, whatever you want. This was a huge area on this girl, and basically a subpeel technique. And you see the lesions, they're hard as a rock. They're beautiful to dissect. They're a pleasure to dissect, really fun for a resident. And this is us peeling it off away from the fissure, which is on the left side. And you see them. So then we just basically amputated at the white matter. That's basically how we take these out. And this girl has done great. So that's one category, focus dominant tuberous sclerosis, where we can do just upfront single stage resection with ECOG if we want. We don't need any intracranial electrodes. That's one category of kids. It's a minority of the categories. I just had a case of that recently. We use grids occasionally to do functional mapping. This is a kid with TSC1 who was diagnosed late, was highly functional, and had this one lesion in a somewhat near eloquent area. And we wanted to map out language, and we wanted to map out some of his other neuropsych functions. So we put a grid in, we did some mapping, and then we took it out. And he did great. Sort of raising the idea, and this is really interesting in the days of RNS now, is do tubers contain function? And at least in our early experience, I would say they do not. I think that the deficits that are seen in removing these are, probably related to access to areas around the tuber. But, we published this early on, basically showing that patients could have resection in Rolandic areas without long-term deficits. We have an experience now with responsive neurostimulation in this population, and we actually published 5 patients with RNS where 3 of them were done these are older kids, seizure foci in eloquent cortex, and 2 of them with thalamic RNS, which is, I'm sure you're doing here, a big deal at our center. I mentioned DBS just to be complete as far as neuromodulation, and I think that we have yet to do DBS in the tuberous sclerosis population, but we're doing it otherwise. So the more typical patient that we see is this network dominant patient. These are really tricky, and these are the ones that are all getting stereo EEG. And so, Dan Curry coined the term dynamic stereo EEG. I know there's a lot of discussion about the nomenclature and how we name the electrodes in stereo EEG, very interesting. But the idea here is that patients will be presented at a conference. We place the stereo EEG electrodes based on a number of factors, as I'll show you, and then we compare with laser ablation or with resection. Interestingly, the first patient that he published for laser was a TSC patient. So the reason this is important is, these kids will be patients of ours for their entire childhood. We may not solve their epilepsy the first time around. Their epileptic network may change, and this minimally invasive approach makes sense, pairing sort of the risk-benefit profile with the chronicity of this. So this is Dan's approach. This is an old picture. This is all done on the computer now, but basically each electrode is chosen based on a specific phase 1 piece of data. So is it a calcified lesion? Is it an enhancing lesion? Is there a MET cluster? Is there a SPEC area of interest, a PET hypometabolism, et cetera? And we use the stereotactic head frame. These are the bolts that are used to place the electrodes. And as I mentioned to you, Dan's first patient, you see number 1 there, was a tuber patient. And Dan has really utilized this a lot for hypothalamic hamartoma, areas that are difficult to access. Laser ablation is essentially, real-time MR-guided MR thermography to destroy an epileptic focus. So this is one example of a child using that approach. It was about 2 who had a resection in that left temporal area at an outside facility. The EEG was multifocal. The child was having these seizures that would lead her to fall to the floor, and she had other seizure types. This is sort of a cartoon of the depth electrodes. You can see, Dan will place 30 electrodes now in some of these patients. And you can see the clinical seizures that we were targeting were all coming from that right frontal opercular lesion. Interestingly, and I would point out to you, with the electrodes, we see this a lot. Look how many subclinical seizures we recorded on the other side of the brain. And the question is, should those be treated? And I'll leave that open for discussion. But the clinical seizures that led this girl to fall to the floor were all coming from that one area. So we could argue taking that out with a craniotomy, doing some motor mapping. In this particular case, we recorded the seizures coming from there. You can see the hot electrode there and the tuber, the defect in the reconstruction. Dan put a second laser fiber, brings the patient back to the OR, takes out the SEG electrodes, replaces those 2 with a laser fiber and ablates it. So you could have done this either way, with resection or with laser ablation. And that seizure type that led to this child falling on the floor has completely gone away. And this child had a huge developmental progress. This is now 8 years old, this case. But she's not seizure-free. So based on the Engel scale, because she's having these other seizures from other areas of the brain that are not disabling, she's not technically seizure-free. So that's a very, very important point, because in the strict Engel score, this would be regarded as a failure. But as we see, this was a huge win for this child and his family, raising this notion that the way we look at outcome in this population of patients that are more complex, as we take on these more complex pathologies, we need to understand that our outcomes, the way we evaluate our outcomes, need to be more individualized. So we treat the seizure focus that is most detrimental to this child, and they have multiple lesions. This is a recent version of our work from Texas, basically showing how we present them at conference, and they'll either get a focal treatment or they'll get stereo EEG followed by whatever the treatment is. And, you know, I think the thing that we hear most from these families is the developmental outcome. A lot of these kids come back. So you'll see this is a very heavily pretreated group. Some of them have gone on from laser to resection, from resection to laser. The point is to be able to deploy this minimally invasive approach when we need to over the life of the child. So we're saying that this is kind of an iterative process. We're not operating on the child and saying that's your only shot. So, and as I mentioned earlier, many of these patients with the network dominant tuberous sclerosis would not have been candidates for epilepsy surgery. You know, when families come back to the clinic for follow-up, they talk about the seizures, but they talk more about the developmental outcome. It's as if a light bulb went on. I have a new child. My child can sit. My child can focus. My child can socialize. And we know that targeting a focus within the network can have a huge, profound benefit for the network. And there's some early evidence in the tuberous sclerosis world that epilepsy surgery will reverse some of the developmental problems. Without getting into too much of the details, the curves up over there, the green lines in the curve show that development in the refractory group surpasses the development in children who don't have surgery. So there's definite evidence now that surgery helps with development. And of course, this is a non-tuberous sclerosis. This article just came out recently from England, basically showing that epilepsy surgery has a benefit to prevent or reverse developmental or neuropsychological trends downward. We know that seizure control and this approach can improve quality of life. And the interesting thing about this is one of the questions we asked the parents in this study were, if you had to go through this whole process again, it's a very intense process for the families of pre-surgical evaluation, all the surgery, et cetera. Would you do it again? And pretty much all but one said yes. So they're willing to go through this for the benefit of their child. And obviously, we understand outcome based on how well we can understand the focality going into this. So we know that some children may never be seizure free. We are considering, we wrote this grant. It didn't really go anywhere, but we want to do a study of early surgery versus medical management in this population. Now, I talked about subclinical seizures, and this is an area of great interest in the pediatric world because, Dan Curry will say, well, in young children, it's very hard to even identify a clinical seizure. They can't talk to us. Sometimes the behaviors are very subtle. So the line between subclinical and clinical in the pediatric population is not so clear. We know from Jury and Peters' work that subclinical seizures definitely predict clinical seizures. And so they're a big deal. They're also not good for the brain. What should we do? So this 2-year-old boy, we did stereo EEG because he was having clinical seizures. His clinical seizures stopped completely during the stereo EEG. And nevertheless, we recorded multiple, almost continuous subclinical seizures from a huge complex in what was anatomically Broca's area. This was his MR. You can sort of see here, it was a very large area. And the question was, he's only having subclinical seizures, but they're frequent. They're in Broca's area. He's 2 years old. He doesn't have language. What should we do? Would you take care of him? Would you not take care of him? So we met extensively with the family. The mom really wanted to go ahead, and we operated on this child, and we took out that area, and his language exploded after that. He is doing tremendously well. And so I think subclinical seizures are detrimental. This is an area of great interest and something, that we'll be discussing a lot. Another thing that came up, and I was interested in this a lot early on, was, okay, we had kids with tuberous sclerosis who had normal looking MRIs and bad epilepsy. We also had kids that came in with subependymal giant cell astrocytomas with lots of tubers in their brain who had no epilepsy. So to me, the relationship between the lesion and the epilepsy was not so clear. And I really wanted to understand this. This was an R01 that I wrote, my last attempt at an R01. Now I have one with Liberty Hamilton, but at the time I was very interested in this question. What's going on outside the lesion? I think it's a concept that has a lot of applications to neurosurgery in general. But, there's been a debate in the literature here. This group felt that the epilepsy was outside the lesion. The group in Australia feels that the epilepsy only comes from the center of the lesion, only from the center of the lesion. And they go so far, Simon Harvey's group, they've published a paper saying that you only need to remove the center of the tuber to get seizure freedom, which is not my experience at all. So Tracy, who's now a pediatric neurosurgeon at CHOP, Tracy Flanders, wrote this when she was one of our medical students. And we looked at this. We looked at our depth electrodes, both in the tubers and outside the tubers. And we basically found, it's very heterogeneous in some patients, as you would imagine. In some patients, the seizure started outside the tubers and some within the tubers. I think the key here is, we need a classification system for tuberous sclerosis, much like we do with focal cortical dysplasia. We looked at the abnormalities outside the brain in the quote unquote normal looking brain, and we found similar molecular abnormalities. And once again, these are these patients that can have really severe epilepsy with the diagnosis of tuberous sclerosis. And these are really tough cases. And we started looking at these with some imaging modalities with 7 Tesla MRI, basically understanding that there's more to the picture. Pete Crino, who's working with us at the time, he's now at Maryland, did a postmortem study and basically found in these patients, much like analogous to the glioma patients, they have a sea of abnormal cells in their brains. So the lesion is really part of the story. So it's really interesting and really complex. Another thing, this is also like I think a philosophic question. This paper came out, Aria Fala put this together. Basically, this is a graph of seizure freedom after surgery. And it's very analogous to this study from the Cleveland Clinic that came out about 12 years ago. Same thing, that if you poll patients over time, if you do a study at 2 years after surgery, your results will look great. Your seizure freedom rate is about 65%. If you go out to 5 years, it goes down to about 50%. If you go down to 10 years, it's almost a third. So, the early failures are obvious. Those are from bad localization, a bad preoperative workup. But the late failures suggest that there's something more complex going on. We all know there are patients who come back 5 years later, they've been seizure free, and all of a sudden they have a seizure. So my question is, what are we doing with these patients? If the goal is this, are we really doing anything? Are we just palliating the situation? And what I would argue is that a lot of what we do in pediatric epilepsy is really palliative, meaning that the seizure freedom notion may not be possible for all of our patients, and it may not be a realistic goal. And nevertheless, we still have an obligation to do the best we can. And I'm not talking about VNS or corpus callosotomy. I'm talking about what I've showed you in terms of TS. So, a lot of these children will have multiple lesions. They'll have multiple seizure types that are driven by these different lesions. And so we need to individualize and personalize the treatment and target the symptomatic seizure that is most problematic for that child. And this implies that if we do that, there will be a benefit. We still have a lot of work to do. We know that from our patients, but we have to show this. And there are a lot of examples of this. I've been talking about tuberous sclerosis, but we know corpus callosotomy fits into this category because many of these children will not be seizure-free technically, but we can stop their drop seizures and really help them. I have my third case ever of a bilateral Sturge-Weber for this Monday when I get back, where one side is worse than the other, and these children are very sick. They can't leave the hospital. Their seizures are really out of control, and we're doing sort of a palliative type of procedure, knowing that they will not be seizure-free. And obviously, the goal here is to benefit them in some way. There are studies out there that basically show a disconnect between patients who are not necessarily seizure-free, but still have cognitive or neurologic improvement after surgery. The Cleveland Clinic showed this again. that, relative seizure reduction was at least as good a predictor of quality of life as seizure freedom. With this minimally invasive approach, with Dan Curry, we can go back. Stereo EEG is much easier to do than repeat grid placement after a child that's had craniotomy. So hence this kind of iterative approach that, and these families come back. So, if they have developmental delay, or epileptic encephalopathy, we can intervene. They may plateau. Parents will come back and say, we want to have even more of a benefit, and we can go back in. And this is unique to this minimally invasive approach. I would say unique to pediatric epilepsy surgery because we're dealing with children over time. So, just some of the concepts. So I think that in the 25 years plus that I've been doing this, has been a huge change. We now see that the question should be who's not a candidate for surgery rather than who's a candidate for surgery. The field has basically exploded. I think that in the next talk, I'll talk about some of the more fun conventional operations like hemispherectomy, corpus callosotomy, but we know that children can improve after surgery, even if they're not seizure free. There's a whole track record now of operating as young as, 3 months old. We published a paper with Jonathan Roth on surgery below the age of 100 days. We know that it's safe. We still, you'll see this next month when this Journal of Neurosurgery Focus video comes out. To be a modern day epilepsy surgeon, you have to really master both these neuromodulation techniques, minimal invasive techniques, but you also have to be able to do temporal lobectomies and all the more traditional approaches. And that may not be the same surgeon. I think that this iterative approach is been important for us, and we've relied heavily in our network dominant patients on the stereo EEG laser ablation model, and we'll be hearing more and more about neuromodulation. So, just to end, I think this field has really exploded. It's super exciting. I think that, the concept of what we're treating is really a focus within a network. And I think that in children, we may not like the term palliation, but we're individualizing treatment based on our understanding and based on the expanded landscape. So thank you very much. And I take questions. Please, questions.
So in you go back 20 or 30 years in adult epilepsy surgery, palliation had a bad name because the psychosocial measures of outcome, of independence, employability, driving, even if you were 90% seizure free, none of those changed, right? You couldn't have a job, couldn't drive, you couldn't be independent. And so those were psychosocial measures. And so what is the objective? I assume you're using a mixture of psychosocial and neuropsychological outcome measures.
Correct.
What is the objective measure of palliation that satisfies you, and what test do you use to determine that?
Well,
Other than just saying, well, the seizures are less frequent.
yeah. So
Parents are happy.
yeah. So exactly. It's a great question. There has to be a significant, reduction in seizures. So that's measured, obviously. Medication, simplifying medications, ability to go to school. I mean, all these kids are evaluated by our neuropsychologists. It's very, as you would imagine, labor intensive. A lot of them go off back to where they were, and we have to come back for this. But I would say that, a lot of in that study that we published on TSC, a lot of the developmental measures that are standard in childhood are used. I would say that, some of this is hard to measure, and I think that a lot of it is subjective, and it's very patient and family specific. So it depends what the starting point is. A lot of these kids are really in trouble going into treatment, and where the family can have a more normal life. Some of them are home runs. So, we definitely have kids that are seizure free that are, like the first girl I showed you, that are exploding. But I think it's a comprehensive approach. So, definitely measuring seizure outcome we do, and neuropsych evaluation I think is important. I've been, as sort of a caveat, I've been very interested in also the behavioral and educational benefits of like epilepsy associated tumor surgery. Because we've had some kids who, you know, where we've taken out of focus and, you know, they've gone from being like, you know, in a psychiatric ward to being normalized. So I think a sort of comprehensive evaluation, but yeah, neuropsych testing, I think will hold sway. Yes,
Times do you see a patient before you'll do a phase 2 monitoring on them?
do what?
Do phase 2, like a stereo EEG? Is it like a one-time visit, or do you see them in the clinic with neurology at the same time?
It's a great question. So usually at our center, what usually happens is they'll come in for a phase 1 evaluation, and there'll be all those tests. It's set up. We have a coordinator. We actually have 2 coordinators that work on this, and they will get imaging studies, et cetera, and then they'll come in and meet with the surgeon or both surgeons and an epileptologist. And so that's one visit, and then they'll all that information will then get processed and presented at a conference the next month. Let's say family will go home, and then we'll pick a surgery date, and then they'll come back and I'll meet them again. Sometimes if they're up in the EMU and I know them or something, we'll see them on, but it's usually 2 visits.
So are you involved with all the epilepsy patients, regardless of whether they may end up getting resection or surgery?
It's a great question. Yeah, so at our center, a lot of the patients are driven by the surgeons rather than the neurologists. So a lot of the patients come in specifically for the surgeons. It's a really good question. The answer is probably no. We don't see everybody, but I think a lot of the ones that are getting the pre-surgical evaluation, we have this sort of system. It's a very uniform system, and I think it works well. It took a long time to develop. And you have to have the right people who have hospitality leading that as the face of that process. It's really tricky. Yeah.
Fantastic talk. We had actually Jorge Martinez come and he gave a fantastic talk on kind of the opposing technique, if you will. But my question is, he was very much so about localization, just like you are, and I think that's fantastic. And we do the same thing in spine. I do it in peripheral nerve, right? If you look at a spine, you could treat every disc, but you want to localize where their symptoms are coming from and only treat what you need to, just like the Beatles said, you know, get what you need. And so the question that I have for you is Jorge Martinez was very much about, I could figure out where your epilepsy is, and I know I could never do that. But with tubers, you know, you kind of want to check all of them. So do you implant all of the tubers? I mean, 30 leads is a lot, but there's a maximum in terms of time efficiency and safety for patients. And so are you like a Jorge Martinez, I can guess where it is and I'm going to limit the leads? Or are you a shotgun approach? I'm going to check all the tubers because there might be something there.
I think it's probably somewhere in between. I would say that it's definitely based on hypothesis, or it's based on the phase 1. The problem is in a lot of these kids, and you know, this is a study that needs to be done, and we've been talking about this for a long time, is going backwards now and seeing, okay, how could we then, you know, AI, how could we go ahead and predict? You know, there's a lot, and I'm working with a lot of people on this question. Can we go ahead and now predict, you know, going into this process, you know, where we'll be at the end, like what we're going to treat. And it's really hard. And that's why it's so fun, because these kids are really hard to predict. A lot of times what we find is not what we go in thinking. Having said that, I think judgment and experience and seniority and like everything, do your reps, being comfortable with the pathology makes a lot of difference. And you know, we talk about like the Rosa computer, we talk about, you know, computer, AI, whatever. This computer is important too. And that's why I show the subpeel technique, because I think more and more as I've gotten older, surgical technique and how you operate on these really matters. Like if you just go in and, you know, you don't know what you're doing and you just cut out a piece of brain, and it's not going to do the trick. You have to really understand the anatomy. You have to correlate, you know, that SEG is like a tiny point in space, or, you know, what is it reflecting? You know, what else is involved? Like the question, you know, you can always take out more, you can't put it back. And in epilepsy surgery, my thing is the challenge always is knowing where to stop. So we had a case 2 weeks ago, frontal cluster of tubers. You know, this girl wasn't talking, she was, so this is an example, not talking, not, you know, like a rag doll. You know, we did a pretty wide resection beyond what I even went into the OR thinking I was going to do, because I could tell from the texture of the tissue, there were still abnormalities there. And it was in the right frontal lobe, we had leeway. And so we did a wider resection, and that girl has done great. And immediately, like the first post-op day, parents were like, she said these words she's never said before. She's, you know, these are anecdotes, but these are real experiences. Like she went back to doing this. She can sit up and play a game. She hasn't done that in 8 months. And so I think that's a combination of factors, but Dan Curry, you know, he does the vast majority of the SEG. I like SEG, but I like the open cases better. But the SEG, you know, I think over time he's added more and more electrodes, basically because we don't know. We're clearly not targeting all the lesions. I disagree with that philosophically. I think I reviewed papers in the past of people who would put electrodes in and just ablate all the tubers. I mean, that's clearly, you know, wrong, but it's a balance, and it's definitely hard. But that's why it's fun, and that's why I enjoy it. It's not like, you know, straightforward. Anyway, yes, sir.
Just building off a little bit, and you touched on this briefly when you talked about the hospitality. I mean, the issue of having a multidisciplinary team and how you navigate the behavioral / cultural differences between neurology and neurosurgery. From my own perspective, you know, working in pituitary tumors and having to find endocrinologists that could speed up and learning how to slow down. Can you just talk about what it's like putting together a multidisciplinary
It's a
team?
great question about putting together the team. So I came from an amazing team that I didn't build, but I joined with Orrin Davinsky. He was a master. For any of you that know him, he's just the most brilliant guy in the room, and just built this mammoth epilepsy center. And, you know, getting buy-in for you, becoming his surgeon was not an easy thing, but we're dear friends, and I was his surgeon for 20 years. But so seeing that, and then coming to Houston, which was already a great center and setup, and Dan was already working there. It was interesting because the first time we'd show some of these cases, some of the adult epileptologists were there and would comment, what are we doing? Why bother? You know, like the first time I presented a TSC case to George Ogeman, he's like, why bother? They're going to start seizing again in a few years, and why bother? And, you know, so I wanted to bother. So the first thing I did was I started showing these cases. I started sharing some of our experience, some of our papers. Some of the patients started coming, and it's developing a shared philosophy, and where ego, it's not about ego. Like I said with Dan Curry, it's not about me, it's not about him, it's 1 + 1 = 3. I think that formula was very successful at NYU, and I wanted it to continue. So one of the first things I did was recruit one of the senior epileptologists from New York that I'd worked with, Jim Riviello, who's like the gray hair in the room. And it's been a process. So the process is seeing these wins, and the neurologist seeing that, wow, you know, this is possible. So there's been an evolution of the philosophy that, you know, we're now, you know, Rohini Kurg, who is a junior epileptologist, who's now, you know, the head of our TSC program, you know, she thinks anything is possible, you know, so but I think it gets back to what I said before. It's about ego, about not having an intact ego, and you know, understanding that the system means something, that the decisions are really, you know, we go back and forth, like, what does it mean to have consensus? Like, is that a medical legal thing? Like, how do we put that in EPIC? Like, like the consensus group recommendation is that this child is a candidate for epilepsy surgery, and we're going to do this. Like, what does that mean? But to me, it's important because at least the family knows that it's not like, you know, like if I'm on call and I see a patient that needs to go to the OR, we know what to do. But like, these are complex decisions that, you know, are elective in some way. And so I think it's a really, really great question. The other thing is, you know, if you're in a center that is not surgically minded, that can be a problem. And I have colleagues who are, and even with our own center, there are some people who are more skittish and less surgically minded, and a nice epilepsy associated tumor on someone that's seizing on 2 drugs, and they're like, oh, let's try, you have to sort of get them. So I think that the key is the people, no ego, and having a shared growth of a philosophy of the center. That's how I view it.
And sorry, just
Yeah.
to build off that real briefly, the comment I was gonna make is that, I don't know what your experience is with your neurologist, but that idea of shared concept and philosophy has turned our endocrinologists into some of the most aggressive pituitary surgeons I know.
Great. Yeah, exactly. They see what you can do, and then, the floodgates open. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Just to challenge the outcome measures a little bit
Yeah.
further. I mean,
Yeah.
you can do a hemispherotomy on a patient who's very disabled
Yeah.
before surgery, with behavioral problems, trouble paying attention, can never listen when the parents are talking to the child. Then after the hemispherotomy, the parents will say anecdotally, well, he seems to be paying attention,
Right.
sort of a soft sign, right? And then the question is, well, 6 months later, or a year later, or 2 years later, exactly how is that child doing as that child is going through, stages of development? And so you're a long-range destination center. It's hard enough, even if the patient lives in the community, to keep up with, and it also gets back to the consensus, with the multidisciplinary team. Yes, there can be consensus, but is it really objectively data-based?
That's right.
And sometimes, there's a group philosophy that leads you in one direction or another, but you're scratching your head saying, well, what's the data that we have to help guide that decision?
No, you're getting at a really good point, and I think,
Because we don't have data on these patients
That's right.
many times, right? You don't know how many seizures they have at night. The parents aren't counting them. And plus your patients come from
That's right.
100 miles away, 1,000 miles away. They come from Europe. How in the world do you know how those patients are doing?
Right. No, you're 100% right. I mean, a lot, we see many patients back, on an annual basis, but not all of them. And the ones that are having difficulties, we tend to see more, which is good. But you're 100% right. And I think I would go even further and say that as we obviously we're using a lot of testing and data from testing and our previous published data to understand what we're doing. But I would even argue that on different days of the week, depending on what Jonathan Finley would say, the manic depressive cycle of the people in the room, the recommendation will be different. So, like depending on what your last complication was, you may make a different recommendation for the same child. So I think I agree with you. There is a definite subjectivity to it. But I still think in the end that, we've published some of this, but also from just following patients, we're having some measure of impact. It's that's what I'm saying. In the pediatric world, it's not as black and white, and yes, no, it's not as, one or the other. Yes, sir.
All right, thanks for such a great talk. Just backing after Dr. Bates's comment, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we just started a tuberous sclerosis clinic here at UR, and we've just passed over 40 patients. So this is definitely going to be a patient with community need. But I was wondering about your thoughts about how age plays a role in the aggressiveness, particularly of surgery, repeat surgery. Does your perspective change for a 2-year-old versus a 12-year-old versus a young adult?
Yeah.
Once there's a more confirmed developmental trajectory in terms of thinking through, going through another repeat phase 2 and a repeat perception.
That's a good question. Age. So I think hopefully you've gotten a sense that one thing I've learned or taken away from my experience is that age is really important, and that the size of the surgery, the scope of the surgery, and the aggressiveness of the epilepsy are inversely correlated with age. So like we sort of say that, the kids that present to us really early on are really the most severe, like what parents would want to have their child have brain surgery, under a year of age. So it's selecting out a really bad group of, affected group of patients. In that group, the network, if you will, is less complex, and that's your shot to do a big operation and really try to, so we talk about these young kids doing the big operation, so a lot of them will have like big temporal lobe resection or a big lobar resection. And then once they're older and they develop a different kind of seizure pattern, it's much more complicated. That's where we get into the SEG laser paradigm. And certainly the teenagers and college age kids, I'm very wary of because the network is so embedded. And in that case, in those patients, you would even have a hard time finding a focus with SEG. So I think if I can make a graph of this, that's how it would be. It would be, I think age is important. And so we're not seeing so many of the 12-year-olds anymore. The average age, I don't know, in that paper is like 3 or something. And we're seeing younger and younger. I think it's important, because there is data that, I showed some of this in TS and non-TS, but, in tuberous sclerosis, the classic triad was adenoma, sedation, seizures, and mental retardation. There's definitely a relationship between the cognitive status and the seizures, no doubt. So, other questions? I think you had a question, or?
It was a more technical question, but I can ask you later.
Okay, sure. Anybody else? I hope it was worthy of the Van Wagenen lecture. It was such an honor.
Thank you.